What's the point of statues? Dr. Anton Howes explains how their original purpose can help us to update them. To the minds of people in the 18th and 19th centuries, public art had a very clear purpose, which seems to have been forgotten in the minds of many people today. Rather than teaching history or even celebrating the memory of a particular person, so much of the art that still dots our public places was explicitly about inculcating virtue, good morals, and good habits. It's a notion that sits uneasily with us now. It's hard to think of any artist today who would be so bold as to tell us how we should think and act. So much of the time, their work is instead subversive, intended to make us question the things we take for granted. If there is a message to their art, it is generally implicit and usually negative. Don't pollute. Don't be avaricious. Don't be violent. Not so for our ancestors. Art in public spaces was explicitly moralizing. Take painting. In the 18th century, following theories that had been around since the Renaissance, painting genres had a hierarchy, with still life at the bottom, landscapes and scenes of everyday life above it, portraits higher still, and finally at the pinnacle, history painting. History painting, which hardly exists as a genre today, encompassed allegorical, mythological, and religious scenes, as well as those of actual history. It deserved its place at the top because being a history painter required more than just mechanical skill. It required intellect and education. The artist needed to be inventive, arranging scenes that never were, and educated enough to choose symbols that could convey meaning. They thus needed to be intimately familiar with religious and classical texts, the educated public's common frame of reference. Yet the symbols and allusions were not just visual puns. History paintings were supposed to be instructive, to inspire viewers to virtue. They typically illustrated the exploits of the great and the good, to set an example to others of integrity and public spiritedness. The subjects were typically taken from classical Greek or Roman history, because figures draped in togas were far removed from the drudgery of everyday modern life. They were uncontroversial and could thus be upheld as paragons of virtue in a way that more recent and local historical figures could not. In the 18th century, a figure like Oliver Cromwell, despite having died in the previous century, was too divisive. Depending on the viewer's politics, he was either an ambitious and fanatical tyrant or a selfless promoter of parliamentary liberties. Such difference of opinion got in the way of moral education. The problem, of course, was in finding people to become history painters. A great history painter, at least in theory, was on par with a great poet. Only a handful were considered both manually skilled and intellectually capable enough to do it. Artists like Angelica Kauffman upended gender stereotypes. Women were thought to lack the genius for anything beyond still lifes. By becoming one of Europe's premier history painters, in general, only the very best, like Kauffman or otherwise the most self-important and arrogant, felt able to fill the preaching role. And there was the issue of money. Most of the demand for contemporary art was from private individuals, who typically just wanted to commission their own flattering portraits. History painting, by contrast, involved artists imposing moral messages on the public. For them to reveal stark truths, they would need to be insulated from the dictates of the market. In the 1750s, they believed that this would require state funding, on the model of the French. To this end, they tried at first to take over the Society for the Encouragement of Arts, Manufactures and Commerce, for most of its history known as the Society of Arts and now the RSA. They persuaded it in 1760 to hold the country's first dedicated exhibition of contemporary art. But they failed to turn it into a state-sanctioned academy, and in 1768 instead founded the Royal Academy. Its annual exhibitions continue to this day. But space was also a problem. Following the Reformation, the most common public buildings, churches, had been largely stripped of their decoration. When a few members of the Royal Academy tried in the 1770s to have some history paintings installed in the St. Paul's Cathedral, its bishop reacted by saying he would never suffered the doors of the Metropolitan Church to be opened for the introduction of property. Painting was too Roman Catholic, and the problem persisted. On the whole, by the 19th century, the only real outlet for public moralizing art was in statues. One of the few exceptions which you should visit when lockdown is over is the huge set of history paintings at the RSA by James Barry. The Victorians became obsessed with new statues, erecting them for all of their favorite historical figures, and choosing ones that would have been uncontroversial to them as paragons of virtue. Thus, in 1895 Bristol, the statue of slave trader Edward Colston was erected because he was a centuries-dead example of someone who had given a lot to charity. To them, he was an uncontroversial paragon of philanthropy. But he's not. If we're to take the context of such statues seriously, then the fact that they have become so controversial is a clear sign that they have failed. They should be removed because they do not inculcate the virtues that they were supposed to. Colston has become remembered as a symbol of murderous avarice, not of honest philanthropy, and so deserves no space on our streets and squares. In his place, we should put a statue that inculcates the virtues that we need. If that is, we can find a sculpture with the 18th century brand of boldness, perhaps even the arrogance, to show the public how we could be better. If you enjoyed this, you might consider buying Anton's new book, Arts and Minds: How the Royal Society of Arts Changed a Nation.